sun's gravitational shadow, concealed by a veil of light-warping particles in its atmosphere. At first, it was dismissed as an anomaly, an imaging artifact caused by the sun's glare. But the anomaly didn't fade. It grew sharper, more defined, until the faint outline of a celestial body was undeniable. The world turned slowly, its surface a dull shimmer, as though cloaked in liquid metal. The mission to investigate was assembled in record time, driven by both scientific ambition and unease. If something had hidden from humanity's gaze for so long, what else might it be hiding? The expedition crew, 30 in total, was composed of elite scientists, military advisors, and engineers from across the globe. As their ship, the Arc-Light, approached the planet, its eerie beauty filled the viewing deck's reinforced glass. "God," someone muttered, "it's like mercury poured over glass." The surface shifted in a mesmerizing display of reflected starlight, as if the planet's atmosphere was alive. Its topography was a patchwork of jagged peaks and smooth plains, marked by enormous spire-like formations that appeared unnatural in their symmetry. No signals emanated from the planet, no signs of life. But the stillness carried weight, a strange, oppressive silence that seeped through the ship's hull. Commander Kira Voss called the team to their stations as they prepared for descent. She stood tall and calm, her piercing green eyes betraying no hesitation. "This planet's been here longer than any of us. Whatever we find, we stick to protocol. No risks, no assumptions." The shuttle broke through the shimmering atmosphere with a bone-rattling shudder. The turbulence was far worse than anticipated, as though the air itself resisted their entry. Outside, the skies churned with iridescent clouds that bent light into impossible hues. Electrical discharges danced between the clouds, casting flickering shadows across the shuttle's interior. When they landed, the ground beneath them hummed faintly, like a low vibration just at the edge of perception. The surface was metallic and cool to the touch, though it yielded slightly underfoot, as if not entirely solid. The air was breathable but dense, carrying a faint metallic tang that left an unsettling aftertaste. As the team set up their base of operations, the spires loomed in the distance, casting long, wavering shadows. Dr. Lennox, the team's biologist, was the first to voice unease. "This place isn't inert," she said, kneeling to examine the ground. "It's reacting to us. Look." She pointed to faint patterns, like ripples, emanating from where their boots had pressed into the surface. The others dismissed it as harmless. Anomalous, yes, but not threatening. Still, Lennox kept a sample, carefully sealing it in a reinforced container. It pulsed faintly under the lab lights, as though alive. The first day passed without incident. Teams surveyed the surrounding area, mapping the structures and collecting data. The spires, upon closer inspection, weren't made of stone or metal, but a material that defied categorization. It felt organic, yet its surface was cold and unyielding. Scans showed faint energy signatures within, like a heartbeat muffled beneath layers of flesh. That night, as the crew settled into their modular quarters, the first anomaly occurred. Joseph Farrow, a junior engineer, didn't report back after a routine perimeter check. His last communication was garbled, distorted by interference that hadn't been present earlier in the day. A search party was sent out, armed and alert. They found his equipment in a neat pile on the ground, his helmet cracked but otherwise undamaged. Of Pharaoh himself there was no trace. His comms unit was still active, looping static interspersed with faint rhythmic clicks. Animals, someone suggested. Maybe he ran into something and panicked. There's no sign of a struggle, Voss countered, her voice tight. And what animal strips a man of his gear and leaves it like this? The team widened their search, combing the nearby area with thermal scanners and spotlights. The shimmering air distorted their vision, casting false shapes at the edges of the beams. Shadows seemed to move independently, flickering like mirages. After hours of searching, they found nothing. By dawn, tensions were high. Whispers of doubt spread among the crew. They were isolated on an alien world with no guarantee of rescue if something went wrong. The sense of unease deepened when Dr. Lennox examined the ground near where Pharaoh had disappeared. The faint ripples they'd observed earlier had intensified, radiating outward from the spot like waves on water. "It's responding to us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, responding?" Commander Voss asked sharply. Lennox hesitated, her gloved hand hovering over the pulsing surface. "I don't think this planet is just a planet. It's alive, and it knows we're here." The hum beneath their feet grew louder, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The team exchanged uneasy glances. Something was watching them, waiting. The shimmering sky above remained silent. The disappearance of Joseph Pharaoh cast a long shadow over the crew. They tried to keep to their routines, pushing forward with their research, but unease hung heavy in the air. Pharaoh's absence lingered in every conversation, every wary glance exchanged during meals, every hour spent scanning the strange terrain for movement. Commander Voss enforced stricter protocols. No one ventured outside alone. Communication lines were triple-checked, and the base perimeter was monitored around the clock. For 3 days, the planet seemed eerily calm, its humming surface and strange structures yielding no new surprises. On the 4th night, everything changed. It began with a voice. "Help me." The sound crackled through the comm system during the late shift, faint and distorted, but unmistakably Joseph Pharaoh's. The control room froze, eyes locking on the speakers. "Did anyone else hear that?" whispered Jenka, the night duty technician. Her hands hovered over the console, trembling. The voice came again, louder this time, raw with desperation. "Help me. It's cold. I don't know where I am." Commander Voss was roused from her quarters, arriving just as the signal shifted. A faint ping began tracing across their scanners, moving toward the base from the direction of the distant spires. The crew gathered in the control room, staring at the display with a mixture of hope and dread. "Suit up," Voss ordered. "We're bringing him back." A team of 5 ventured into the alien night, the air thick with metallic tang and a deeper, unshakable tension. Their floodlights carved through the shimmering haze, revealing the faint trail of heat signatures leading toward the spires. As they drew closer, the signals became more erratic, flickering like a dying heartbeat. They found him near the base of one of the towering structures. Pharaoh was hunched over, his back to the search party. His suit was intact, though scuffed and stained with streaks of an unknown black substance. At first, he didn't respond to their calls. "Joseph," Voss said, her voice firm but calm. "We're here. We're taking you back." He turned slowly, his movements unnaturally stiff. The beam of their lights caught his face, and several of the crew gasped. Pharaoh's features were intact but wrong. His skin was too smooth, his eyes too glassy. He opened his mouth to speak, and what emerged was a garbled imitation of human speech, the words cracking and popping like a corrupted audio file. "Help. Me." Voss didn't hesitate. "Get him to the medbay." The team hauled Pharaoh back to the base, his weight unnervingly light, as though his body was hollow. In the medbay, Dr. Lennox conducted a frantic examination. Beneath his suit, his skin was pale and waxy, rippling with faint movements just beneath the surface. Lennox peeled back his suit with trembling hands, revealing thin tendril-like growths spreading across his chest, pulsating in rhythm with his heartbeat. This isn't Pharaoh," Lennox whispered. "At least not anymore." As she spoke, Pharaoh's body convulsed, his head twisted sharply, eyes fixing on her with an intensity that froze her in place. His mouth opened wider than it should have, the jaw stretching with a sickening crack, and a long, sinewy appendage shot out, aiming for her throat. Lennox screamed as the crew tackled him, pinning his writhing body to the medbay floor. Pharaoh, or whatever had taken his form, thrashed violently, his skin splitting to reveal the creature beneath. It was a grotesque mass of tendrils and translucent membranes, glowing faintly with bioluminescent veins. The creature screeched, its voice mimicking Pharaoh's cries for help, even as it lashed out. Voss acted quickly, grabbing a scalpel from a nearby tray and plunging it into the creature's exposed core. It shrieked and writhed, its tendrils spasming before collapsing in a lifeless heap. The remains hissed and dissolved into a black, viscous sludge, leaving only the shredded remains of Pharaoh's suit. The control room descended into chaos as the news spread. Paranoia gripped the crew. If the creature could mimic Pharaoh so perfectly, who else might it have taken? The realization set in like a cold weight. The planet's silence had been a ruse. They weren't alone, and whatever was out there could walk among them undetected. The next day, a second voice was heard over the comms. It was Jenka's voice, despite her being accounted for and visibly trembling in the control room. The voice repeated fragments of her speech, stitched together like a broken recording. "I don't understand. Where? I'm so cold." Lennox's theory took shape, horrifying in its implications. The creatures weren't just mimicking appearances, they were learning. They absorbed memories, speech patterns, even emotional responses, creating perfect copies of their victims. The copies weren't entirely stable, though. The process left behind fractures, gaps that became more noticeable over time. But by the time anyone realized, it was often too late. Over the next 48 hours, trust disintegrated. Small behaviors, a misplaced word, an unfamiliar gesture, were enough to spark accusations. The crew splintered into factions, each suspicious of the other. Isolation bred fear, and fear bred mistakes. Then the next disappearance occurred. This time it was one of the researchers, a quiet, methodical woman named Rhea. Her bunk was found empty in the morning, her personal effects untouched. Hours later, she reappeared, wandering the base as though nothing had happened. She smiled at her colleagues, her eyes wide and glassy. "What's wrong?" she asked in a voice that was too steady, too rehearsed. "It's me. I'm fine." But the real Rhea had been left behind. What stood before them was something else entirely, and it was learning faster than they could adapt. The base felt smaller with every passing hour, its narrow corridors and modular walls pressing in as the crew's paranoia spiraled out of control. The events surrounding Rhea's return had shattered whatever fragile unity they had left. No one could say for certain if she was still human, though her gestures were eerily precise, her voice uncomfortably measured. Even the smallest mistake, a slight hesitation when answering a question, a misstep in her usual routine, set everyone on edge. Voss ordered Rhea confined to the medical bay for observation, though it was clear the others felt the move was too lenient. The murmurs started immediately, accusations that Voss was protecting her, that she was compromised herself. The whispers grew louder when Dr. Lennox announced her findings. Rhea's DNA showed subtle but undeniable mutations. Whatever had happened to her out there had changed her at a fundamental level. Rhea sat on the examination table, her head tilted slightly as she watched Lennox from the corner of her eye. Her lips curled into a faint smile. "You're all so tense," she said softly. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm still me." But the words felt wrong, like an actor reading a script. The tipping point came when the base's power grid flickered during the second night of her confinement. Emergency lights cast the halls in an unsettling red glow as alarms blared. The crew scrambled to restore power, but the systems seemed to resist their attempts. It was as if the base itself was turning against them. Jenka was the first to point fingers. "She did this," she hissed, jabbing a trembling finger toward the medbay. "She's sabotaging us," Rhea's calm voice filtered through the comms. "I didn't touch anything. I don't know why you're blaming me." But even as she spoke, her voice wavered, and for a moment it seemed to split into two tones, her own and something deeper, almost animalistic. The sound sent chills through the crew. Someone shouted, and the group erupted into chaos. Voss tried to restore order, her voice cutting through the din. "Enough! We don't know what's happening yet." "We know exactly what's happening," Jenka snapped. "She's one of them. And if you're defending her, maybe you are too." That accusation was the spark. A physical altercation broke out, pushing the already fragile group to the brink. Weapons were drawn, and for a tense, horrifying moment, it seemed as though they might turn on one another. The lights flickered again, plunging the base into momentary darkness. When they returned, Rhea was gone. The medbay door was wide open, its locking mechanism melted into a twisted, unrecognizable mass. Panic set in as the crew spread out to search for her, but she wasn't the only one missing. In the confusion, two more crew members had disappeared, Jenka and Torres. Their comm signals went dead, leaving only faint static in their wake. The group reconvened in the control room, their numbers now critically diminished. Voss stood at the head of the table, her face pale but determined. "We have to stick together," she said. "If we keep splintering, we're handing them the advantage." But her words fell on deaf ears. Trust was already eroded beyond repair. Every glance, every movement was scrutinized with suspicion. Even Dr. Lennox, who had been steadfast throughout the mission, began to falter. She withdrew into herself, muttering about how the planet's biology was unlike anything they'd encountered before, how it seemed to adapt faster than she could study it. "It's not just the creatures," she said quietly to Voss when they were alone. "It's this whole place. It's like it's alive. I think it's watching us." That night, the crew decided to post armed guards outside the control room, a futile gesture born of desperation. Voss took the first shift, pacing the perimeter with her weapon drawn. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the planet beneath their feet. Then came the sound, a faint, wet scraping from one of the far corridors. Voss froze, her grip tightening on her weapon. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by the faint shuffle of footsteps. She called for backup, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "We've got movement near Sector 3. The others rushed to join her, their weapons raised, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural clicking that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered. The answer came when Torres stepped into the light, or what was left of him. His body was contorted, his limbs unnaturally elongated, his face twisted into a grotesque approximation of a smile. His skin shimmered faintly, as though coated in the severed the planet's surface. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, a wet, slithering noise spilled out, followed by a burst of clicking. His head twitched unnaturally, his eyes fixing on Voss. "Don't leave me," he rasped, his voice barely recognizable. Then his chest split open with a sickening crack, revealing a writhing mass of tendrils that lashed out toward the group. Gunfire erupted, the deafening roar reverberating through the corridor. The creature that had once been Torres stumbled backward, its flesh peeling away to expose the alien form beneath. It shrieked, its voice an unholy cacophony of human screams and inhuman clicks, before collapsing in a heap of viscous black ichor. The crew stood in stunned silence, their breaths ragged. Voss lowered her weapon, her hands trembling. "This isn't a fight we can win," she said hoarsely. "We have to get out of here. Now." But as she spoke, the hum of the planet grew louder, reverberating through the walls and floors like a heartbeat. The crew exchanged fearful glances. It wasn't just the creatures anymore. The planet itself was waking up, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The plan was hastily assembled and riddled with flaws, but they had no choice. The creatures were everywhere now, their mimicry so precise that it was impossible to distinguish ally from enemy. The base had become a labyrinth of suspicion and death. Voss knew they couldn't hold out much longer. The planet wasn't just hostile, it was predatory, and they were already caught in its jaws. The remaining crew, Voss, Lennox, and 3 others, huddled in the control room, their faces pale and drawn. The hum of the planet had grown louder, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Outside, the spires glowed faintly, their light pulsating in sync with the sound. The atmosphere rippled, the iridescent haze thickening as if the planet itself was closing in. "We power the shuttle manually," Voss said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "We bypass the main systems and force a takeoff. It doesn't have to be perfect, just enough to get us off the ground and out of this nightmare." "And if the shuttle's been compromised?" Lennox asked, her voice shaking. Voss didn't answer. They all knew the truth. If the creatures had infiltrated the shuttle, their escape would be short-lived. But staying wasn't an option. The planet would consume them one way or another. They moved quickly, gathering what supplies they could carry and sealing off unnecessary compartments to conserve power. The hum beneath their feet grew sharper, more insistent, as if the planet could sense their intent. Shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, and every creak of the walls felt like the whisper of an unseen predator. As they reached the shuttle bay, the lights flickered again, plunging them into momentary darkness. When they came back on, one of the crew, Marcus, was gone. "Marcus?" Voss called, her voice echoing through the cavernous bay. There was no answer, just the faint sound of dripping, like water falling onto metal. Lennox grabbed Voss's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't go back for him. You know what happens." Voss hesitated, her gut twisting. She wanted to argue, to say they couldn't leave him behind, but she knew Lennox was right. Marcus was gone, and whatever was left of him wasn't human anymore. They boarded the shuttle in silence, their breaths shallow, their eyes darting toward every shadow. The air inside was stifling, thick with the scent of fuel and the faint metallic tang that seemed to permeate everything on this cursed planet. Voss took the controls, her hands steady despite the chaos raging in her mind. "Manual systems engaged," she said. "Prepare for ignition." The engines roared to life, sputtering and groaning as the shuttle strained against the planet's gravitational pull. The hum outside grew deafening, a low, guttural vibration that made their teeth ache. The spire's glow intensified, their light bleeding into the sky like veins of molten metal. Then came the first impact. Something slammed into the hull with enough force to shake the entire shuttle. Voss cursed, her fingers flying over the controls. "Brace yourselves!" The creature clung to the viewport, its form a grotesque mockery of humanity. Its flesh rippled and split, revealing tendrils tipped with barbed hooks. Its face was a distorted amalgamation of features, familiar and wrong, as though it had pieced itself together from scraps of memory. It stared directly at Voss, its lips twisting into a jagged approximation of a smile. "Don't leave," it hissed, its voice layered with dozens of others. "Stay with us." Voss hit the thrusters, the shuttle lurching upward as flames burst from the engines. The creature screeched, its tendrils lashing at the glass, leaving deep, jagged scratches. Another impact shook the shuttle as more of them began swarming the exterior, their shrieks blending with the planet's hum in a cacophony of horror. "They're on the hull!" Lennox shouted, clutching her seat as the shuttle tilted violently. "Hold on!" Voss yelled, forcing the controls forward. The engines roared louder, the shuttle shuddering as it broke through the thick, shimmering atmosphere. The creatures clawed and writhed, their bodies igniting in the friction of the ascent. One by one they were torn away, their screams fading into the void. For a moment, silence fell. The blackness of space stretched before them, vast and empty. The crew exhaled in unison, the weight of their survival sinking in. But the relief was short-lived. A faint clicking sound came from the rear of the shuttle. Voss turned slowly, her blood running cold. Lennox was staring at her, wide-eyed, her hand pressed to her chest. "It's inside," she whispered. One of them got inside. The realization hit like a blow. They had been so focused on escaping the planet that they hadn't considered the possibility of infiltration. Voss rose from her seat, her weapon drawn. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the narrow corridors of the shuttle. They found it in the cargo hold. It had taken Marcus's form, its features perfect except for the eyes, which shimmered with an unnatural, iridescent light. It smiled as they entered, its expression eerily calm. "You can't run," it said in a voice that was almost human. "We're already with you." The creature lunged, its form unraveling into a mass of tendrils that filled the room. Voss fired, the bullets tearing through its body, but it didn't stop. It moved too quickly, too fluidly, its tendrils snaking around her arm and pulling her closer. Lennox grabbed a nearby fuel canister, her face a mask of desperation. "Get back!" she screamed, slamming the canister into the creature and firing her weapon. The explosion was deafening, the heat searing as the creature disintegrated in a burst of black ichor. When the smoke cleared, Lennox lay motionless on the floor, her body charred and still. Voss staggered back to the controls, her heart pounding. The others were gone, consumed or worse, but the shuttle was intact. As she set the coordinates for Earth, the hum returned, faint but unmistakable. It was inside her head now, a low, insistent pulse that wouldn't fade. The shuttle drifted into the void, leaving the cursed planet behind. But Voss couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't truly escaped. The hum was a reminder, a warning. The creatures had learned, adapted, and now they were coming. For Earth. The starship Vanguard had been cruising through the void for 137 years. Designed for the long haul, its corridors buzzed with the hum of machinery that kept life sustainable for its 312 crew members. Starlight flickered faintly through the reinforced viewports, a reminder of the vast emptiness surrounding them. Every aspect of the journey was meticulously calculated, every breath of oxygen accounted for. There was no room for deviation until the derelict vessel appeared. It came into view during the morning shift, a fractured silhouette on the radar. The ship was vast but unrecognizable, its design bearing no resemblance to anything in human records. Mira Kwan, captain of the Vanguard, stood in silence on the bridge, her brow furrowed as the rotating image of the vessel spun on the holographic display. "How long until intercept?" she asked. 4 hours at current speed, replied Navigation Officer Tamsin Rowe. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of unease to it. Encounters like this were supposed to be rare, almost impossibly so. "Prepare a boarding team," Kwan ordered. Protocol dictated caution, but the potential for discovery outweighed the risk. If this ship carried anything valuable, new technology, data, even evidence of intelligent life, it could alter humanity's future on Proxima Centauri B. By the time the Vanguard reached the vessel, the crew was abuzz with speculation. From the observation deck, the derelict loomed like a dead thing, its hull battered and corroded, yet still oddly intact. There were no visible insignias, no indication of its origin. only jagged scars and strange organic-looking protrusions that made it appear less like a machine and more like a fossilized creature. The boarding team consisted of 5 members, each clad in reinforced suits. Among them was Dr. Aiden Roth, the ship's chief medical officer, who joined the mission to assess any biological hazards. The team floated across the void, their boots magnetized to the alien hull. The airlock, once pried open, exhaled a rush of stale, acrid gas, as though the ship itself were breathing its last. Inside the vessel was a labyrinth of dark corridors and eerie silence. The walls were covered in a crusty fibrous material that crackled underfoot. Bioluminescent streaks pulsed faintly along the surface, casting the hallways in an unsettling green light. The team moved methodically, their scanners picking up faint energy signatures. "What the hell is this?" murmured Jonah Carver, the team's lead engineer, as he shone his light on a cluster of spore-like growths protruding from the wall. The structures twitched ever so slightly, as though alive. "Don't touch anything," Roth barked, pulling out a containment kit. He scraped a sample into a vial and sealed it tightly. The scanner beeped erratically as he ran it over the spore cluster. "It's organic, but nothing I recognize." Further inside, they found a central chamber. Alien consoles lined the walls, their surfaces etched with unreadable symbols. In the center lay a gnarled object that resembled a cocoon, roughly the size of a human torso. Its surface glistened with a viscous black substance. "Looks like some kind of containment unit," Roth said. He reached for his tools, but Carver stopped him. "Let's just take what we can and leave. This place gives me the creeps." Against his better judgment, Roth relented. They gathered what samples they could. Artifacts, fragments of the fibrous wall, and a chunk of the cocoon-like structure. By the time they returned to the Vanguard, everyone seemed eager to leave the derelict behind. Back on the ship, the samples were secured in the research lab, and the boarding team underwent decontamination. Protocols were followed to the letter, yet an unease lingered, as though the derelict had left something behind. That night, Carver complained of a headache. By morning, he was burning with fever. The research lab became the center of activity. Roth examined the spore sample under a microscope and was stunned by what he saw. The spores were not dormant as he'd assumed. They were dividing rapidly, forming intricate vein-like networks. Worse, they seemed to react to the lab's sterile conditions, adapting to them. Carver's condition deteriorated. His fever spiked to dangerous levels, and he began muttering incoherently, his words fragmented and nonsensical. "It's inside," he rasped at one point, convulsed violently, as though fighting an invisible force. By midday, Carver was dead. His body lay still on the medbay table, but something beneath his skin was moving. Black tendrils erupted from his chest, coiling outward like living roots. The medical staff recoiled in horror as the tendrils thrashed, breaking apart monitors and instruments before collapsing into a twitching heap. Alarms blared across the ship. The lab went into lockdown, but whispers of the incident spread quickly. Crew members began to feel the weight of their isolation more keenly. The Vanguard was their home, but now it felt like a prison, its walls closing in as fear took root. Roth spent hours reviewing the derelict's data logs, but they were incomprehensible, a mess of symbols and distorted audio. One phrase, however, played over and over in his head. It had been faint, buried in the static of the recordings, but unmistakable. "We are the seed." The meaning was unclear, but Roth's gut told him it wasn't a message of peace. The atmosphere aboard the Vanguard shifted from unease to palpable fear. Jonah Carver's death had shaken the crew, but it was the grotesque transformation of his body that haunted them most. The black tendrils, silent now but still faintly twitching, were sealed in a reinforced containment unit in the lab. Yet the damage had been done. Whispers spread through the ship's cramped corridors, fueled by speculation and paranoia. Dr. Aiden Roth worked tirelessly, isolating himself in the lab to analyze the parasite. The spore's cellular structure defied human understanding, adapting and evolving with a speed that bordered on malicious intent. It wasn't a simple infection. It was an invasion. The tendrils extracted from Carver's body continued to grow even after his death, pulsating with what seemed like a faint rhythm, as though they were still alive. Roth suspected the organism had a purpose, though what it sought was beyond his comprehension. Captain Mira Kwan called a meeting in the main briefing room, her face pale but resolute. The remaining department heads filed in, their expressions grim. The room felt stifling, despite the ship's regulated climate. "We need to get ahead of this," Kwan began, her voice steady despite the murmurs rippling through the room. "Dr. Roth is doing everything he can, but containment protocols are non-negotiable. No one leaves their designated sectors unless absolutely necessary." Lieutenant Dean Marlowe, head of security, leaned forward. "With all due respect, Captain, people are scared. They're talking about shutting down the ventilation system, saying it's spreading through the air." "It's not airborne," Roth interjected, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "The spores require direct contact to infect a host." "And you're sure of that?" Marlowe shot back. "Because Carver wasn't exactly rolling around in the stuff." Roth hesitated. "There's still a lot we don't know." The room erupted into arguments. Some advocated for stricter isolation measures, while others insisted on evacuating the infected sections entirely. Kwan silenced them with a sharp command, but the tension was unmistakable. Trust was fraying, and fear was taking its place. Within days, the ship descended into chaos. Crew members began reporting hallucinations, shadows moving in the corners of their vision, faint whispers in the quietest moments. Some claimed to hear voices calling their names, while others spoke of feeling watched. The paranoia spread faster than the spores, infecting even those who had never been near the lab. It was engineer Lila Mendel who first snapped. She had been working on the hydroponics bay when she attacked her partner, slamming his head against the console with such force that blood sprayed across the glass walls. By the time security arrived, she was crouched over his body, muttering incoherently as she clawed at her own arms. Black veins had begun to creep beneath her skin, radiating outward from her chest like cracks in porcelain. Kwan ordered the bay sealed off, but Mendel's outburst only deepened the crew's suspicion. People began accusing one another of being infected. Old grievances resurfaced, and alliances formed in whispers behind closed doors. Roth noticed that the infected were no longer the only ones acting strangely. The paranoia seemed to be a side effect of exposure, a psychological unraveling even among those who hadn't yet shown physical symptoms. The isolation orders became a source of contention. Some crew members barricaded themselves in their quarters, refusing to answer their comms. Others formed small cliques, arming themselves with whatever they could find and patrolling the corridors like sentries. Quan tried to enforce order, but her authority was slipping. Even the bridge crew began second-guessing her commands, casting furtive glances her way when they thought she wasn't looking. Roth, meanwhile, made a horrifying discovery. The parasite wasn't just growing, it was communicating. He observed faint electrical impulses traveling through the tendrils, as though they were exchanging information. Worse, the patterns began to resemble the structure of neural activity. It wasn't just an organism, it was intelligent. He brought his findings to Quan, who listened in stunned silence. "Are you saying it's aware?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's more than that," Roth replied. "It's learning, adapting. It's using us, our bodies, our minds, as tools." Before Quan could respond, the ship-wide comm system crackled to life. A distorted voice echoed through the corridors, garbled but chillingly human. "We are the seed," it said. The message repeated, each iteration more fragmented, until it dissolved into static. The comm system had been offline for days, disabled as part of the containment protocols. No one could explain how the message had broadcasted, but its effect was immediate. Panic erupted across the ship. People began abandoning their posts, fleeing to whatever places they felt were safe. Quan's orders went unheeded, and Marlowe's security team struggled to maintain control. That night, someone sabotaged the containment lab. The reinforced unit holding the parasite was destroyed, its contents smeared across the floor like spilled ink. Roth found himself locked inside his quarters, the lock overridden by an unknown source. Through the viewport, he watched as the dark veins began to creep along the walls of the ship, their rhythm pulsing faster, as if in anticipation. The Vanguard had been a haven, a beacon of hope for humanity's future. Now it felt like a coffin, its crew spiraling into madness. The parasite wasn't just destroying their bodies, it was tearing apart their minds, their trust, their very humanity. By the time the lights flickered and died, plunging the ship into darkness, the fracturing was complete. No one trusted anyone, and somewhere deep in the bowels of the ship, the parasite pulsed, growing stronger. The lights aboard the Vanguard were dimmed now, their faint glow barely enough to illuminate the desolate halls. Power rationing had become a necessity after sabotage crippled several key systems, but even this pale illumination seemed too much for some. The crew huddled in isolated clusters, their eyes bloodshot, their movements furtive. No one spoke unless absolutely necessary. Silence had become the only way to survive. But silence did nothing to mask the changes. Dr. Aiden Roth sat hunched in the lab, its once pristine surfaces now smeared with a mix of blood and black ichor. The containment unit was destroyed, the parasite released, and it was spreading. Roth hadn't slept in days, and his reflection in the cracked monitor confirmed what he already knew. He was changing, too. The faint discoloration around his eyes, the trembling in his hands, early symptoms he had documented in others. He was running out of time, but he couldn't stop now. The parasite's cells were like nothing he had ever seen. They didn't just infect, they integrated, weaving into the host's body as though they belonged. The tendrils spread along the nervous system, syncing with neural pathways, hijacking thought and motor control. But what unsettled Roth most was the intelligence. The parasite wasn't just adapting to its environment, it was reshaping it. The infected weren't dying. They were becoming something else. A loud crash from the corridor snapped Roth from his thoughts. He froze, listening. The sound was wet, heavy, followed by a dragging noise. He grabbed a scalpel, a pathetic weapon against what stalked the halls, and moved toward the door. It opened with a hiss, and he stepped into the dim corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. The thing standing at the far end of the hall had once been Lila Mendel. Her body was a grotesque mockery of its former self, her arms elongated and distorted, ending in sharp, bone-like claws. Her skin was mottled with patches of blackened veins, and her face, it was barely human. The lower half of her jaw hung loose, her teeth replaced by jagged, chitinous protrusions. But it was her eyes that chilled Roth to his core, dark and lifeless, yet aware. She turned toward him, her movements jerky, unnatural, her head tilted as though she were listening, though no sound passed between them. Roth took a step back, his breath shallow. "Lila," he whispered, though he knew the person she had been was long gone. She lunged. Roth barely made it back inside the lab, slamming the door as her claws raked the frame. The metallic screech echoed through the ship, but no one would come to help. The crew had already learned to abandon those who drew the infected's attention. He watched through the small viewport as she stalked away, her body twitching with each step. She wasn't hunting him. At least, not yet. She had something else in mind. In the darkness of the lower decks, more changes were taking place. The infected were no longer just individuals. They were congregating, drawn together by an unseen force. The parasite was connecting them, creating a network of shared thoughts and purpose. The crew's barricades meant nothing. The infected worked together with terrifying precision, dismantling obstacles, flushing out the uninfected like prey. Mira Kwan stared at the security feeds in the command center, her face a mask of barely contained terror. The cameras flickered, showing brief glimpses of the infected tearing through what remained of her crew. "They're building something," she murmured, her words almost drowned out by the hum of failing machinery. Beside her, Lieutenant Dean Marlowe frowned. "Building what?" Kwan shook her head. "I don't know, but they're working together, like they're following orders." "It's not possible," Marlowe said, though his voice lacked conviction. "They're mindless." "No," Kwan said, her voice hollow. "They're not." Deep in the bowels of the ship, the infected gathered around a grotesque structure, a mass of black tendrils and twisted flesh that pulsated like a beating heart. It was growing, expanding, consuming the ship itself. The Vanguard was becoming part of the parasite, its systems integrated into the organism's sprawling network. The ship was no longer a vessel for humanity's survival. It was a hive. Roth's research revealed a grim truth. The parasite wasn't just transforming the crew. It was using them to evolve. The black veins that snaked through the ship weren't just growths. They were conduits, transmitting signals and energy. The infected weren't acting independently. They were extensions of a singular, malevolent intelligence. The changes in the uninfected were more subtle, but just as horrifying. Crew members who hadn't succumbed to the parasite were showing signs of psychological collapse. Hallucinations blurred the line between reality and nightmare. One engineer locked himself in an airlock and jettisoned into space, convinced he was being hunted by something invisible. Others turned on each other, their paranoia reaching a fever pitch. Quan tried to maintain control, but even she wasn't immune. She woke one night to find black veins spreading across her forearm. She stared at them, horrified, before realizing they were only an illusion, a cruel trick played by her unraveling mind. She hid her trembling hands during briefings, unwilling to show weakness, even as she felt herself slipping. The infected, however, showed no such hesitation. They moved with a purpose that defied explanation, their bodies reshaping to suit their needs. Some grew additional limbs, their spindly forms scuttling through the ventilation shafts like spiders. Others developed hardened exoskeletons, their movements slower but deliberate, their strength overwhelming. In one horrifying encounter, Marlowe and his remaining security team found themselves cornered in the cargo bay. The infected surrounded them, their grotesque forms illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. The fight was brutal, but futile. Marlowe's screams echoed through the ship, but no one came to his aid. By the end of the week, fewer than 20 uninfected crew members remained. They communicated only through whispers and hand signals, avoiding the ship's increasingly alien corridors. The Vanguard was no longer theirs. It belonged to the parasite, and it was hungry for more. The Vanguard was no longer a starship. What had once been a marvel of engineering, humanity's arc toward a new world, was now a dark, throbbing labyrinth. The walls were alive, pulsating with black veins that coiled and stretched like muscles flexing in the dark. The air, heavy with the scent of decay and something chemical, burned the throat with every breath. It was alive, feeding, growing. The ship's original purpose had been overwritten. It was a hive now, and its queen lay deep in the reactor core. Captain Mira Quan sat slumped in the corner of the communications room, her hand clutching the pistol she had taken from Marlowe's remains. Her uniform was tattered, her face gaunt and hollowed by exhaustion. Around her, the shattered remains of consoles and flickering screens were smeared with blood, some hers, some not. The last transmission she had sent was a warning, though she doubted it would ever be received. Do not approach the Vanguard. Destroy on sight. Do not bring it aboard. The message had barely left her lips before the console had gone dead, as if the parasite itself had silenced her. Across the ship, the infected continued their relentless transformation. They no longer resembled humans. Their bodies, twisted and broken, had adapted for specific roles within the hive. Some scuttled through the ventilation shafts, their elongated limbs perfect for navigating the tight spaces. Others guarded the main corridors, their hulking forms armored in layers of hardened black chitin. And at the heart of it all was the Queen, if it could be called that, a writhing mass of tendrils and flesh that pulsated with a malevolent rhythm. Aiden Roth had seen it. He had been dragged there by two infected who still retained shreds of their original forms. He had fought, screamed, and begged, but it was futile. The Queen had no eyes, no discernible face, yet he felt it, watching him, judging him. Its tendrils reached out, probing his skin like curious fingers before plunging into his chest. Pain exploded through his body as the parasite tore through his nervous system, integrating him into its collective consciousness. But Roth was not like the others. His mind resisted, clinging to his humanity even as the parasite tried to overwrite it. In the chaos of their shared consciousness, he glimpsed its memories, its purpose. It was no accident that they had found the derelict vessel. It had been waiting for them, drifting through the void like bait. The parasite was ancient, older than any species Roth could comprehend. It was a weapon, a biological machine designed to consume, assimilate, and evolve. It would not stop at the Vanguard. It would reach Proxima Centauri B. It would reach Earth, and it would make them all its own. Roth's resistance did not last long. When he returned to the crew, his body twisted and half-consumed. His eyes were black pits devoid of the man he once was. He walked with purpose now, a vessel for the Queen's will. Quan had seen him in her final attempt to reach the reactor core. He stood in her path, his body grotesque but still recognizable. "Captain," he said, his voice a strange blend of his own and something deeper, alien. "It doesn't have to end this way. Join us." She had hesitated, her pistol trembling in her grip. For a moment she saw the man he had been. The doctor who had saved countless lives, who had comforted the sick and injured. But his smile, his voice were all wrong. He was a puppet, his strings pulled by something far beyond her understanding. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and pulled the trigger. Roth's body collapsed, black ichor pooling beneath him. The hive screamed in her mind, a piercing psychic wail that sent her staggering to her knees. But she got up. She had to. She had one last chance to stop this. The reactor core was unrecognizable. The once gleaming machinery was buried beneath a thick, pulsating cocoon. Tendrils stretched from the central mass, plugging into consoles and power conduits, feeding on the ship's energy. The Queen was here, its grotesque form dominating the room, its tendrils writhing in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was waiting for her. Quan moved carefully, her breath shallow. Her objective was clear: detonate the reactor. The ship's self-destruct sequence had to be activated manually, and she had the codes. But the Queen sensed her presence. A low, guttural sound filled the chamber, like a deep, mocking laugh. "You think you can stop me?" The voice echoed in her mind, resonating with a power that made her knees buckle. "You are nothing. A fragile, fleeting thing." Quan gritted her teeth, ignoring the voice. She reached the console, her trembling fingers entering the override codes. Behind her, the Queen began to shift, its massive body heaving as it prepared to strike. Black tendrils lashed out, tearing through metal and cables, but Quan didn't stop. Come on," she muttered, sweat dripping into her eyes. The final code entered. The reactor began its countdown. 10 minutes. The Queen roared, its voice a deafening psychic assault that brought Quan to her knees. Images flooded her mind, worlds consumed, civilizations erased, Billions of lives subsumed into the parasite's endless hunger. For a moment she faltered, the weight of its horror crushing her spirit. Then she remembered Carver, Roth, Marlowe. The faces of her crew, twisted and consumed, flashed before her. She forced herself to stand, gripping the pistol in one hand and a canister of fuel in the other. "You don't get to win," she said through clenched teeth. She hurled the canister into the Queen's core and fired. The explosion ripped through the chamber, fire engulfing the writhing mass. The Queen screeched, its tendrils flailing wildly, but Quan didn't wait to see the aftermath. She stumbled back through the corridors, the walls shaking as the reactor prepared to detonate. Her escape pod was the last functioning one on the ship. She climbed inside, sealing the hatch as the countdown reached its final seconds. Through the viewport, she saw the Vanguard in its final moments, the black veins glowing with an eerie light as the hive screamed in fury. Then, in a blinding flash, it was gone. Quan drifted in silence, the pod systems barely functioning. She stared at the empty void, her heart heavy with loss and guilt. But she had done it. The parasite was gone. Or so she thought. In the shadows of the pod, a faint black vein pulsed, unnoticed, as it crept along the floor. Waiting, the Odyssey entered Earth's atmosphere with a smoothness that belied the unease gripping its crew. Captain Mira Holloway sat rigid in her seat, her knuckles white against the armrests. It wasn't the descent that unnerved her. It was the silence. "Earth Control, this is Odyssey, requesting clearance to land at designated coordinates. Please confirm," she repeated, her voice calm but edged with tension. Static crackled over the comms. It had been hours since they'd attempted contact with Mission Control, each unanswered transmission stoking their growing anxiety. Earth Control had never gone dark before, not in their lifetime, not even during the worst crises humanity had faced. "Maybe it's just interference," suggested Dr. Samir Patel, his tone too casual to be genuine. Mira caught the nervous flick of his fingers against the console, his habitual tell. "Interference doesn't last this long," said Nadia Reyes, the ship's security officer. Her voice carried a hard edge, but her eyes betrayed unease as she scanned the monitor, where the usual bright web of Earth's communications grid was conspicuously absent. Below them, the surface of Earth stretched out, serene and unbroken. The vast urban sprawl of what had once been a thriving metropolis gleamed faintly under the sun, its outlines intact, its streets eerily devoid of motion. They landed in what should have been a bustling aerospace complex. The landing pad was empty, its automated docking systems unresponsive. The Odyssey's engines powered down with a hum that echoed too loudly in the stillness. "Systems stable," Marcus Voss, the engineer, reported. His voice sounded muted, as if even the ship had noticed the oppressive quiet outside. The crew disembarked cautiously, their boots clicking against the metallic platform. The air was breathable, the readings from their suits confirming normal oxygen levels, but it carried a faint, acrid tang that Mira couldn't place, a wrongness she couldn't define. The facility, pristine in appearance, was devoid of any human presence. Tools lay abandoned, as if their operators had simply vanished mid-task. A cup of coffee sat on a console, still half full, its surface undisturbed by time. Mira's gut churned as she scanned the area. "Fan out," she ordered, gripping the handle of her sidearm. "We gather as much data as we can. Something's off here." The crew split into pairs, their movements purposeful but edged with caution. Patel and Alara Cho, the ship's biologist, moved toward the labs, while Mira stayed with Voss, surveying the control center. Reyes lingered near the ship, her weapon drawn, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Patel's voice crackled over the comms. "Captain, you should see this." Mira and Voss joined him in the main laboratory, where Patel stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the floor. A crystalline growth jutted from the tile, faintly translucent, its veins pulsing with a faint greenish light. Ilara knelt beside it, her gloved hand hovering inches above its surface. "What is that?" Mira demanded. I don't know," Ilara stammered. "It's not natural. These growths weren't here 2 years ago." Voss crouched to examine the structure, his brow furrowing. "It looks like something we studied on the Aurora 7, Zyphor. But this is different." The name hung in the air like a curse. Zyphor had been the centerpiece of their mission. A bioorganic substance harvested from a distant anomaly, its properties revolutionary, and until now, harmless. Mira's pulse quickened. "How did it get here?" she asked, her voice low. No one answered. The silence thickened, broken only by the faint hum of their equipment. "Captain," Reyes' voice cut through the tension, "you need to come back to the landing zone. Now." They ran, the heavy thuds of their boots echoing through the empty corridors. When they reached the ship, Reyes stood at the perimeter of the platform, her weapon trained on a figure at the edge of the compound. It was a man, or at least the outline of one. His body was thin, almost skeletal, and his movements were jerky, unnatural. His skin glistened faintly, and as he turned toward them, Mira's breath caught. His face was partially crystallized, the veins of the alien substance running through his flesh like invasive roots. His eyes, one human and the other a faceted shard, locked onto hers. The figure took a halting step forward, then another. Reyes shouted a warning, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he opened his mouth, and a sound emerged. Not words, but a guttural choking noise that sent a shiver through Mira's spine. "Stop!" Reyes barked, her finger tightening on the trigger. When the figure lunged, she fired. The body collapsed in a grotesque heap, its crystalline sections shattering on impact. What remained of its human side twitched once before going still. The crew stared at the remains in horror. The acrid tang in the air was stronger now, clinging to their nostrils. "What the hell is happening here?" Voss whispered. Mira turned away from the corpse, her expression grim. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it started with us." The sprawling city stretched out before them, an unbroken expanse of stillness. Towering skyscrapers rose into the sky, their glass facades catching the pale sunlight, giving the illusion of life where none existed. The streets below were littered with abandoned vehicles, doors ajar as if their occupants had fled in haste or simply ceased to exist. Captain Mira Halloway tightened her grip on her weapon as the team advanced through the streets, each footstep a jarring reminder of the oppressive silence. The faint, acrid scent in the air had grown stronger, tinged with something organic and faintly metallic. Mara didn't voice her growing suspicion, but she could feel it gnawing at her. Something about the air itself felt wrong. They moved cautiously, with Reyes taking point and Voss guarding their flank. Elara Cho had taken to carrying a handheld scanner, its faint hum the only sound in the stillness. Patel trailed behind, his gaze darting nervously to the empty windows above, as if expecting a crowd of unseen eyes to peer back at him. "This place feels like a mausoleum," Voss muttered, his voice low. "Too perfect, like time just stopped." Mira didn't reply. She had been thinking the same thing. Everything they encountered seemed frozen in the moment of abandonment. A cafe table with half-eaten meals now hardened to stone-like consistency. A child's toy car lying overturned on a sidewalk. Clothes, tattered and brittle, left in piles as if their wearers had evaporated. They turned a corner and entered what appeared to be a research facility. A plaque by the entrance read, "Genesis Bioengineering. Innovation for tomorrow." The irony was not lost on them. "Let's check inside," Mira ordered. The interior of the building was dim, lit only by sunlight filtering through grime-coated windows. The reception area was empty, but a trail of dark, organic-looking streaks led further into the building. Elara crouched down, running her scanner along the substance. "It's biological," she said after a pause, "and it's active. These readings, they're similar to Zypher, but mutated." Mira felt a chill creep down her spine. Mutated how? Hard to say, but whatever it is, it's spreading. The team moved deeper into the facility, their tension palpable. In the labs, they found signs of hurried evacuations, papers scattered across the floor.